the second part is really a bit of an easier process than the first. This is where we're going to be recoloring the images. So what I should have mentioned before is make sure that you're always saving. That's something so important. Right now I have this little asterisk next to the tab for my file, and it's there because I haven't saved recently. So I'm just going to hit Command S, and that's just going to allow me to save the demo project. And for some reason it's wanting to save it as something else. So we're just going to go with it. Okay, so now that I know that's saved, everything's good. Now I'm going to be creating some adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are located on the right hand side of your interface, and they're typically above your layers palette. They do all sorts of things. You can control brightness and contrast, levels, curves. We're going to be getting into a lot of these things, but for this particular project, what I'm going to be focusing on is the hue and saturation adjustment layer, which pretty much changes the color or hue, since this midterm is really about color, and can also play with the saturation and the lightness. So it's a really useful adjustment layer. One of the things that you need to be sure about in the creation of this midterm project is that you do have all of your layers in the proper hierarchy, and that you have multiple layers inside of groups. So for instance, I've got all of my layers in my tree group here. I've got all the layers for my bushes 1 and 2 here. I've got all the layers for my sky and for my Eiffel Tower. By having them remain in the groups, I'm kind of making life easier for me as I move ahead. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and select my tree group, and I'm just going to click on the adjustment layer for hue and saturation. And what that does is that places an adjustment layer right above my tree group. Now, by default, if I were to use this, it would control everything underneath it. And what I mean by that is if I start to play around with the hue, you notice that all the layers, not just my trees, not just the Eiffel Tower, but all of them are affected. So what I want to do first and foremost is just have this affect the layer underneath it, or in this case, the group underneath it. So what I want to do is I want to place my mouse right in between the hue saturation adjustment layer and my group. And then I'm going to click on my Option or Alt key on my keyboard. So now this hue saturation layer is only affecting my tree group. The last step I want to do, I'm not actually changing anything yet in terms of color, I'm going to do that later, but I do want to click on this little colorize button. This will make your life much easier. And I'm basically going to do the same task for each group. So now I'm selecting bushes 1. I'm going to select my hue saturation adjustment layer. I'll go ahead and click colorize just to make that happen quickly. And then I'm going to hold down Option while clicking in between the group and the hue saturation adjustment layer. I'll click bushes 2, select my hue saturation adjustment layer, click colorize, and then simply link it to the group underneath it. So this is pretty repetitive. Once you do it a couple times, it's pretty easy. But I want to do it for each group. I'm finally at the sky layer, and I'm simply just linking that to the sky. So now, because I have, if I go over here, okay, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 groups, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adjustment layers. So you should have equal amounts. And if you have just a singular layer that's not in a group, but you want to affect it in the same way, you'll do the same thing. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And now here comes the fun part. I'm going to save this file as 4 times because I want 4 copies. Each copy is actually going to be a different color scheme. So if you've forgotten your color schemes, you can quickly go into Blackboard. For some reason, my computer had to restart, so forgive me, I've got to get back in there. But you can go into Blackboard, and in our class, you can go to the weekly agenda for week 2 and just download that color theory PDF. And that will just give you all of those different color schemes that we've talked about. Because I realize that sometimes we can't think of them off the top of our head. So those color schemes are monochromatic, which is one hue in all of its tones and shades; analogous, which is a combination of hues next to each other on the color wheel; complementary, which are hues opposite one another; and triadic, which is that triangle that covers 3 colors. Typically red, blue, and yellow would be a common one. So I'm going to File, Save As this image 4 times. The first one I'm going to name Mono, just as a shortcut for monochromatic. Then I'm going to go in and Save As again, and this time name it Analogous for my analogous color scheme. Saving As simply makes a copy. I'm going to name this one Complementary, or just Comp because I'm lazy. And then my last one will be named Triadic. Now I won't do each and every one of these for you, but I'll do a couple of them just so I can show you the process. If I were to go into the folder where all of these are located, I will have a monochromatic image, which right now looks identical to the rest. I will have an analogous, a complementary, and a triadic. So you'll have 4 separate images. So now that I have each of these 4 images, I want to go ahead and start to recolor them. So I'll go with the monochromatic one first, just because that's the first color scheme we learned about. And this is the easy part. I simply choose a color for this one that I'd like to use. So I'm just going to click on the adjustment layer in my layer palette, and I double click on it and it brings up its properties. And I can just, kind of move around and find a hue that I like. Maybe I want this kind of all in a bluish tone, maybe, no, I'd say like a bluish green tone. I can bring up the saturation if I want, just to have it pop. The monochromatic color scheme is the only color scheme where you are going to have to keep note of the numeric value for your hue. The rest of them you're using multiple colors, but for monochromatic you're only using one color or hue. You can change the saturation and lightness a bit, but you're only using one color. So I know this is 197. So when I go to the next adjustment layer, I can just type in 197 and it brings me to the exact same color, which is nice. And then from there, I can just change it as I so choose. Okay. For some reason, this doesn't look like it's working. I'm trying to see what this is linked to. All right, so that's working. That's good. Again, I've selected 197. Maybe I want these slightly darker. I'm not sure why that adjustment layer isn't working for my bushes underneath it. So I'm just simply going to delete it and actually just create a new one just because it's just as easy. I'm just linking it to it, and then I'm just going to make sure this says 197, and I forgot to colorize it, so that's kind of important too, and make sure it's colorized. Okay, all is good. Now I can simply darken that like the other one. So what I'm doing is I'm selecting each hue adjustment layer and I'm just changing the hue to match the others. Maybe I want the Eiffel Tower super bright and a little lighter. I can do that. And then finally for my sky, I could even lighten that up a little more if I wanted to, so that I create a color scheme using my hue and saturation layers that keep everything one color and its different shades and tints. I'm going to save this. Now when you go to print this, one thing to remember is to check in with the printing company that you're choosing if you're outsourcing your print and not doing it from home. You can just give them a call, ask them what file formats they prefer. I'm just going to give you a few different options you may have. One, if I go to File, Save As, I can choose, you never want to give them a Photoshop file format. That's great to work in, but that's not good to give to a print shop because it just, you never know what you'll get. JPEG is a very popular one. It will compress it automatically so that you don't have to worry about compressing the layers or anything. It's a very popular one, but it does compress the data, so sometimes you lose a little bit in terms of quality. Also, another file format that's very popular is PDF. The only thing you're going to want to do is if you choose PDF, and this again is at the tail end, so after you've completed all of these images and you like what you have and you want to take it to Staples or Office Max, this is when you do this. This is when you'd compress your file. You want to, in a PDF, click off of the layers option. You just want it without layers, because if you give an external company layers, you never know what's going to happen with them. And finally, TIFF. And again, just make sure TIFF does not have layers. So JPEGs, PDFs, and TIFFs are your most common files to give a print shop. So when you are ready to take this project to be printed, make sure that you have those files. I'm just going to go ahead and open up the analogous one, and we'll just do those two. You can figure out the others. But with analogous opened, I'm again going to do the same process, but this time looking at the color theory PDF, I want to find colors next to each other on the color wheel. So maybe for my analogous color scheme, I'm going to use orange, yellow, orange, and red, orange, these colors here. So I'm simply going to select the hue saturation adjustment layer above my tree group, and I'm double clicking on it. And now I'm just going to change the hue. Maybe I want this to be orange. That looks good. And now I'm going to select the hue adjustment layer above the bushes, and maybe I want those to kind of be a yellowish color. And I'll do the same thing with the bushes to the right. Maybe I want my Eiffel Tower to be red, but a really bright saturated red. And maybe I want my sky to be more of a yellow, just because that's a lighter color. So you can see for this one, I'm not changing, looking at the hue number as much, because I'm kind of eyeballing it, and I want you to eyeball it. But now these colors are much more similar. They're near each other on the color wheel, and this is what we would call an analogous color scheme. I'd save that, and then when it comes time to print, of course, save it as a copy, either that TIFF, PDF, or JPEG option, depending on what the place you take your print to will prefer. If you're printing from home and you have Photoshop, then you can probably keep it in its native Photoshop format. So at the end of this, you will have 4 different options for this. One will be monochromatic, one will be analogous, one will be complementary, which are opposites, and one will be triadic, which are 3 colors, typically red, yellow, and blue, or green, orange, and violet. Okay, and that concludes the demonstration part of this. Thank you.